Hello everyone, welcome back to SMITE Comprehensive Guides. This is the SMITE Comprehensive Guide to Terra. I will be covering the itemization of Terra here. This is a continuation of Anisu's request for me to cover healing supports, and Terra is my next favorite support that heals, outside of Sylvanas and Horus, who I will eventually cover, but Horus is one of my favorites for primarily the reason that he's physical, so he can really throw a lot of dynamism into a team composition that the enemy might not expect. That's a whole conversation for the Horus episode. For now, let's talk about Terra. Now, Terra is in some ways very similar to Sylvanas in that she has very impressive auto-attack capabilities. This is primarily due to the Standing Stones passive, which does give her bonus damage on her auto-attacks whenever there is a stone farting around. And these stones specifically are the Crushing Earth or the Monolith. Right, either of these will trigger this. So, for that particular reason, she is very similar to Sylvanas in that way of having potentially very powerful auto attacks. Hers tend to hit harder, and she does have a cleave, but they're not ranged. So basically you're trading the range of Sylvanas for a bit more damage, basically. Now, there are some ways in which I build her very similarly, but there are a lot of things that Terra can do that Sylvanas just can't, because not all of Sylvanas' abilities can do damage, whereas everything Terra does can do damage if you decide to use it that way, and that is really going to depend on, to some extent, the circumstances. So let's talk about it. Now, obviously, of course, as with the case of most supports, Sentinel's Gift is here, War Flag is here, two of my favorite support items. War Flag, again, we've got Terra with these strong auto attacks, or these potentially very strong auto attacks, so War Flag really does help out there, besides the fact it actually gives you a little bit of magic power, especially with the War Banner that is actually a damage increase of 4. Doesn't sound terribly impressive, but really depends on what else you build with it. But it is a nice little boost. I tend to build War Flag into War Banner in a lot of situations. Again, there are specific scenarios in which I don't. But a lot of the times this is my favorite starter item on Terra. If I don't have enough fellow, allies with strong auto attack based kits or, enough hunters or whatever, then I won't go with this. I'll go with Sentinel's Gift a lot of the times. But if for some reason I feel like the team's magic damage is just lacking, I will go into Animosity, because that is fairly effective, right? Just a very classic item. Now, you might be wondering, with Sylvanas, I very specifically recommend that potentially you would use something like Gilded Arrow, right, to boost his auto-attack damage very directly, and I'm not recommending that here. Why is that very specifically? Well, there are a couple of primary reasons, one of which, and this has a decent bit to do with it, is that Terra's auto attacks provide a slow, so damage isn't necessarily your chief concern here. Right? You might normally want to think about building Gilded Arrow on Terra. However, if you want to boost her auto attack damage, there are a couple of better ways of doing so. Because unlike Sylvanas, who just has AoE ranged autos, Terra actually can get a magic power boost added on to her auto attacks. So if you really are going to actually dedicate yourself to an auto attack build on Terra, it's actually better to build Telkine's Ring to splash on a little bit of extra damage, rather than go with Gilded Arrow, and Animosity will just help you stay, relatively tanky with that increased 400 health, and also give you bonus damage on your auto attacks, which is fairly helpful. Right? I just personally prefer Animosity. You still can use Gilded Arrow, don't get me wrong here. It actually is, it comes out fairly similarly in terms of total damage output. Unlike, say, Ymir, who has a very heavy favorability towards Gilded Arrow based on his passive, Terra is very much, between Animosity and Gilded Arrow. That doesn't really make a difference. But what is very interesting is because her auto attacks can get some scaling on there, it's at 10% scaling very specifically, it's actually very possible to build Death's Temper, or my personal favorite, Death's Brace, which actually gives you a really great 11 damage increase, which again doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you combine that with certain other items, it actually does really add up, and you also get some 2% of your health back, and since your passive does give your auto attacks a cleave whenever there's a standing stone, that also really helps you heal your health and mana back in the middle of big team fights, or if you're trying to clear a wave, or if you're even just fighting in the middle of a wave, it can really help in that particular aspect. I don't really build this unless I'm going solo lane Terra, in which case, yeah, I'm typically going to use Death's Embrace as a form of self-heal, and then build the rest of Terra in pretty classic auto-attack mage form, basically, where I splash in some protections like Shogun's Kusari, some physical protections in there, throw on Telkine's Ring, call it a day. Similar scenario, but I'll use Death's Embrace for that. I'll typically only go Animosity if I am looking to add some damage. Say, for example, I'm the only form of magic damage on the team as a support Terra, and I'm like, oh, I need to do something for magic damage here, otherwise we're just going to get swept, because the enemy team can just get away with building full physical protections. That's obviously not good, so I'll adapt by building Animosity, but a lot of the times I am just going to go War Flag. Again, my favorite starter item on her. Sentinel's Gift if there's not enough allies for that. Now, I almost always build something out of this tree. Again, typically Shogun's Kusari. We'll get to that in a bit. But beyond my usual, whatever starting item I go with, again, typically War Flag, I will often go for some form of physical protection. Again, standard compositions are 3 physical. Physical is my go-to. I will usually go into Sovereignty, just as a standard form. Again, very good. Now, Terra has an interesting difference compared to, say, Sylvanas. Now, Sylvanas can sometimes get away with Gauntlet of Thebes, depending on how aggressive you're feeling. More aggressive Sylvanas players will wind up never building Gauntlet of Thebes because they're just so aggressive that they wind up accidentally killing minions. It's a similar kind of thing with Terra, but because Terra tends to have large sweeping versions of damage, right? It tends to get a bit more difficult, because for Sylvanas, his only really consistent method of dealing damage besides his auto attacks, at least to minions, is his throwing out the seed, right? And that's gonna land on the minions and do a lot of damage to them. His ult doesn't affect minions, and neither does his heal, right? If you actually, they might have changed the heal. I can't remember off the top of my head. But if you look at Sylvanas, Verdant Growth is going to hit minions. Wisps aren't going to. Nature's Grasp does not, and Wrath of Terra does not. Terra, however, all of her abilities, if used correctly, are going to damage minions. Force of Nature is going to damage minions. Crushing Earth, whether you're slamming the stones together or you're breaking them, that's going to damage minions. The Monolith, if you break this, is going to damage minions. In fact, the only thing that doesn't damage minions that Terra does is Earth and Fury. Now, the problem here, at least in terms of Gauntlet of Thebes on Terra, does come down to the fact that a lot of these are really wide-sweeping abilities. Crushing Earth is a fairly small area if you slam the stones together, but if you break these shatter in a really substantial cone. This is a really big cone that these are hitting, and you're hitting 2 of them, theoretically speaking. At least 1, usually 2. That is a lot of stone flying around, hitting whatever, and it's pretty inevitable that if you do this, you're going to basically, by accident, potentially kill minions. And it's the same thing if you decide to shatter the Monolith. That's going to do damage over time in a very large area, and that is going to wind up accidentally killing some minions. So, as slow as Gauntlet of Thebes can be, it's typically even slower with Terra. So I really don't build Gauntlet of Thebes on Terra in most situations. In fact, I don't think I've built Gauntlet of Thebes on Terra at all this year. In fact, just because the meta's sped up a little bit. I used to be able to get away with it a fairly regular amount of times, but nowadays I really can't. It just doesn't work anymore for Terra. There are some Guardians it does. Terra is not one of them. Okay? So a lot of the times I am going into that sovereignty. Now, if for some bizarre reason I am expecting a double magic damage dual lane, say I'm expecting a magic ADC plus a guardian, maybe I'll go into Shogun's Kusari a little early. Maybe I will instead throw in Fablest Hoops, which is remarkably effective on Terra, because this is just allied gods being healed within a certain radius of you. There is no cooldown on this. Do you know the amount of flowers you can generate with this on Terra's heal? It's really insane. Okay? Generate flowers, please. It is an absolutely phenomenal time. Something else I want to mention while we're here is Manticore's Spike. Now, Manticore's Spike triggers on hard crowd control, and while there's some inconsistency with this item at this particular point in time, this has been getting better over time. Terra actually has two forms of hard crowd control on her abilities. First off, when you crash the two stones together on Crushing Earth, that's a stun, that's a spike. A lot of people know that. What a lot of people forget is that Monolith is a root, and theoretically speaking, if everything is working the way it's supposed to, that root will generate more spikes. Okay? So you have two abilities in your kit pretty consistently that can generate Manticore's spikes on Terra. So she's better with Manticore's spikes than a whole lot of other supports are. In fact, most gods cannot generate as many spikes as Terra can, right? So you do have that, and it is worth mentioning that both of these are very effective, especially when you consider the fact that both of these provide you with a good amount of MP5, again, so does Shogun's Kusari, and that allows you to maintain, in a similar way to Sylvanas. Sylvanas has Verdant Growth to really bolster his MP5, and doesn't need items for this, but Terra does. But if you build Fablest Hoops, Manticore Spikes, or both, or possibly throw in a Shogun's Kusari in there, you're going to have enough MP5 where between that and your healing, you really can sustain for really extended amounts of time as Terra, at least in the mid-game. So you can, at some point, generate the same levels of sustain that gets Sylvanas so far ahead in a lot of his matches if you're playing him correctly. Right? You can emulate that from basically the mid-game onwards. Now, it is worth mentioning that just like Sylvanas, Terra is not as concerned about this in shorter game modes like Joust or Arena, but unlike Sylvanas, where that basically removes the point of throwing down plants, right? Verdant Growth then becomes almost exclusively a root in those game modes. For Terra, not really a big difference. She doesn't play any differently. For Sylvanas in Arena and Joust, you just basically don't throw down Verdant Growth for the sake of MP restoring plants. It's just not as necessary in those shorter game modes. Terra doesn't have that problem, so it just kind of becomes more of a matter of just not necessarily building these for the MP5, right? But for Conquest, and maybe even for longer Slash games, this MP5 can really come in handy a lot of the times, and while you're not building them specifically for the MP5, it's a really nice bonus that can help you as a support to stay in the game, accumulate even more golden experience, and eventually just be able to be as beefy as you need to be to survive the enemy assaults and protect your allies. So back to kind of the linear build here. A lot of the times I'm going War Flag, a lot of the times I'm building Sovereignty. Again, classic example. Sometimes, like I said, it's Shogun's Kusari. But what is my third item? My third item usually is going to, in fact, be Manticore's Spike. Now, I really like Manticore's Spike as my third item because it gives me both protections. Again, this is assuming a 3 physical, 2 magic comp. Minions are doing physical damage, towers are doing physical damage. You don't want to stop building physical protections just because it's your third item, and that's a mistake I see a lot of supports nowadays doing. Is in the long run it doesn't matter, but in the short term, which is of course really important for supports because they are basically subsisting off of assists, it's pretty important for you to not die as a support in the early to mid game. you can recover from it, but it's going to be a speed bump for your growth throughout the match. Because again, you're subsisting off of assists, and that doesn't generate as much experience, even if you build Sentinel's Gift, right? You're not getting bonus experience, you're getting bonus gold. The most important thing for a lot of supports in the early to mid game, and the reason why dying is so painful for them, is they are losing experience, because nothing's going to get that back to you. There's nothing. It's difficult to recover from an experience deficiency. It's very difficult for supports to recover from that. Gold you can get. That's not the biggest concern for a support. It's that experience, and the longer you can stay out in the field, and the better you can survive and make it back to Fountain cleanly, the more experience you're going to accumulate, which is going to keep you alive longer. And building a dual protection item as your third item, which is typically what I try to do, is going to really help you survive a lot more than building a pure magic protection item as your third item, or if the enemy team composition is heavily magical, building a pure physical item. You kind of want to almost slide into the less important protection, because in most matches there is going to be a less important protection. Whether that be physical or magical is going to depend on the enemy team composition, but usually it's magical. So a lot of the times I am going into the Manticore Spike as a third item. Even if I build Shogun's Kusari as a second item, I'm still probably going Manticore Spike as my third. Right, it is going to give me that MP5, it is going to give me some health, it is going to give me both those protections. Even if you're building Animosity, if you're going for that late game Animosity damage build, Manticore Spike is great because it is increasing your health, which is 9 more damage on your auto attacks. Right, so Manticore Spike is a really consistent build for me, very, very often. I build it a lot, okay? It's just very, very good on Terra. Now, my fourth item is going to be where I'm going to throw in those magic protections. Again, usually my go-to is Shogun's Kusari. Now, you might be like, Professor, why not build Fabulous Hoops? You absolutely can. I'm only really using Shogun's Kusari in this example because I have War Flag in this example. Again, this is my usual build based on team compositions, based on personal experience. If I had Sentinel's Gift as my starter item, I would default to Fabulous Hoops here. In this particular instance, I am picturing in my mind my team comp wants increased auto attack speed, so I'm building Shogun's Kusari to complement the War Flag, boost their attack speed even more. Right? Again, if I build anything that isn't War Flag, my go-to is typically going to be Fabulous Hoops. Well, I say that, but if I'm building Animosity, I'm still going with Shogun's Kusari. If I'm going with Death's Toll, that's really going to depend on the specific context based on how the solo lane is going. Right, because I only really build Death's Toll in the solo lane, as a solo lane Terra, right? So there's all of that, but in this particular instance, yeah, it's going to be Shogun's Kusari. So, but Fabulous Hoops is equally viable as an option. It's going to give you that 10% cooldown, it's going to give you really great MP5, it's going to give you health, it's going to give you magic protections. Basically, you're just swapping out increased attack speed for a health shield that you get whenever you heal allies. That's the basic decision there. And how important that is going to, again, depend on your team composition. But for this example, let's go Shogun's Kusari. So I've got War Flag, Sovereignty, Manticore Spike, Shogun's Kusari. Now, again, assuming standard composition, 3 physical, 2 magic, I'm going to want some other form of physical protections. I have a couple of interesting options here. Right? If the enemy team is really auto-attacky, I'm going to go into Witchblade. Right, if the enemy team is not really auto-attacky, I'm probably going to just go into either Contagion if they have a lot of healing, or I'll go into Breastplate of Determination. Right, a lot of the times right now, I'm going to be going into Breastplate a lot of the times. It's just how it goes. Very common for me. Just based on what I've been seeing, really. What my final item is, though, that's where Terra really deviates from Sylvanas. Because, again, going back to Sylvanas, not all of Sylvanas' abilities deal damage, right? His pull does not deal damage, so while he does have some potential to use things like Gem of Isolation and Spear the Magus, the utility isn't necessarily all there, right? Because how many enemies you damage with wisps depends on how many enemies are nearby you at the time, which they might not be. You can only hit usually 2 to 3 people with a single verdant growth in most team fights. Your ult can be very devastating if you have enough enemies nearby. Terra is much less concerned. Again, going back very specifically to the 2 stones here, right? Crushing Earth. Again, this is a really wide cone. You build something like Gem of Isolation or Spear of the Magus, and this is going to... those passives are going to affect, very likely, a lot of enemies in that situation, because you do have these 2 stones you can blast into large cone shards, basically. And you have 2 of them, too, so you don't even need to necessarily aim them in the same direction. If you really want to, because you do get 2 dashes with Force of Nature if you dash through a stone, blast one stone one direction, turn around, blast the other one in the complete opposite direction, you're going to cover a huge area, right? It's just a lot easier to hit multiple enemies with a dangerous passive with Terra. Some of my favorites are, in fact, Gem of Isolation, which a lot of people... this used to be really popular, and I was kind of a Gem of Isolation denier on Terra for quite some time, but as I, got more experienced with her, I realized that while... and I'm going to take a couple of really interesting examples. Let's talk abilities in the context of Gem of Isolation. A lot of people don't realize that Earthen Fury is going to damage the enemies after 4 hits. Right? It doesn't matter what the source is. Enemy receives damage. It can be from literally anything. 4 hits, boom, damage. You got Gem of Isolation, 4 hits, boom, damage plus slow. Doesn't matter where you are in relation to them. Doesn't matter what just happened to them. As long as they're affected by Earthen Fury, and you have Gem of Isolation, whenever that damage hits, a slow is slapped onto them. And that can make a really interesting difference if you're really aggressive with your Earthen Fury. Again, that's really going to depend on you. If you're a more aggressive support player, which I think a lot of players have become because of this meta, which is totally fine. Not judging at all, that's the way the meta is kind of encouraging you to do so, and I encourage you in turn to be a bit more of an aggressive support, within reason. You play aggressively with Earthen Fury, build Gem of Isolation. It's going to become quite a surprisingly powerful trigger when, the enemy's running away, they're desperate, your allies hit them 4 times, slam, they're hit with some damage, boom, they're also slowed. Right, the same thing applies to Spear the Magus. All of a sudden, the enemy takes some damage from your ult, boom, they're taking increased damage. That's not a fun time for any enemy, right? So Earthen Fury is kind of like a surprise bonus effect whenever you have Spear of the Magus or Gem of Isolation, and I tend to build Gem of Isolation. But if the enemy team is tanky enough, or really my allies really need the damage boost, I'll go Spear of the Magus and throw on a nice damage increase for a lot of enemies just by throwing out an Earthen Fury in the middle of a team fight. My allies are healing after 4 hits, my enemies are getting damaged and receiving increased damage thanks to Spear of the Magus. It's surprisingly effective, and I am not kidding you, absolutely no one sees it coming. Nobody ever sees this coming, because they're just seeing the stones around them. They know subconsciously, assuming they've played against or with Terra before, they know at some point they're going to be taking that damage, but suddenly they take that damage and now they're slow, or now they're taking more damage. That is quite a game changer, okay? The same thing actually applies in no small amount to Monolith. And you might think initially, oh, Monolith roots the enemy. Ooh, that's not going to really play well with the slow. Wrong. Unless the enemy literally jumps or dashes out of that radius, once they're done being rooted, because that's damage over time, every half second, they're going to have a refreshing Gem of Isolation slow. So as long as they're standing within this broken monolith, slow, 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 right? Until they eventually leave that radius. And the amount of difference that can make, you might think to yourself, slows aren't that big of a deal. veterans know, right? Long time players know how scary slows can be. Sometimes slows are even scarier than hard crowd control because you probably don't want to use your beads on a slow. It seems kind of extreme, you know. It's just a slow. You can walk away. You'll take a bit of extra damage, and then suddenly you're slowed for a consistent 2 seconds, 3 seconds, depending on how long you're in that monolith radius. And suddenly you're taking a large amount of damage because you're dodging nothing while you're slowed. So Gem of Isolation really comes in surprising handy with Monolith. And this also applies to, like I said, Crushing Earth. Again, you can break these stones in completely different directions to cover an even larger area. You don't have to break them in the same direction. And as a result of this and the absolutely huge area they cover, potentially, you can inflict a really impressive slow, and in fact, I don't usually go out of my way to break these stones unless I have Spirit the Magus to increase their received damage or Gem of Isolation, right? Gem of Isolation and Spirit the Magus on Terra offer you a whole lot of really interesting and surprising opportunities to affect the enemy team in a very negative way. Even dashing through enemies with Force of Nature is going to trigger these, right? And you might notice also, very interestingly enough, that you have very low scaling on a lot of these. This is 50% when you first break it, and then 5% after the fact. Earth and Fury is 60%. You know, not a huge amount of damage output there, but Gem of Isolation absolutely is an incredible slow. And I'm actually going to take a moment to shout out Ethereal Staff here. Have you ever been in the middle of a team fight as Terra and wished you had more max health? Well, at the start of a team fight, blast your ult out there, and then as your allies damage enemies, and they take that damage from the Ethereal Staff, boom, look at that. Spontaneous increase in max HP. Now, the cooldown of E-Staff makes this a bit more inconsistent, to be fair, but I've had it actually make a bit of a difference in my ability to survive a team fight long term, right? I'm getting that increase in max health. We team fight, and now, you know, by the end of the team fight, because I had increased max health due to the E-Staff, I suddenly have a bit more health to play with after the team fight. It's something that's worth playing with against tankier team compositions that have a lot of max health. I don't generally use this on squishier comps. I'm generally going to go with Gem of Isolation or Spirit of the Magus. And you might be wondering, Professor, which one do you choose? How do I decide? My general go-to for my general question is, how many members of the enemy team don't have escapes? And that's going to decide on whether or not I go Gem of Isolation or Spirit the Magus a lot of the times. Because if the enemy team has, like, a Ra and a Freya, and maybe they've got one of the slower solo laners, maybe they have a solo lane Amazon Cobb, for example, right? He has no escape. The Gem of Isolation is devastating because they can't get away, right? Even if you don't root them, even if you don't stun them, a slow is enough for anybody who doesn't have an escape. Aposh, Anubis. There's just a couple dozen gods that just die when they get slowed, right? And that's what it basically comes down to. If there's enough of them with some form of escape, be it a dash or a jump or whatever, I'll go for Spirit the Magus a lot of the times. Again, if the enemy team is really tanky, I'll go E-Staff. That doesn't happen very often. But that's generally my criteria. I basically ask the question, how many enemy gods will just basically die whenever they're slowed? Poseidon's another great example. Zeus. You know. But that's generally my criteria. Do I build Rod of Asclepius? The answer is, in short, depends on how many other healers I've got on my team. If I'm playing support Terra and my mid lane's a hell, yeah, I'll build Rod of Asclepius. No problem. Chang'a's another great example. Maybe I have a solo lane Chang'e. Sure, I'll build Rod of Asclepius. Do my allies just not heal? Then generally Rod of Asclepius isn't going to really be that important, because just your heal, and it's not a huge heal. Think about it this way, right? That's a 20% increase in heal, right? Monolith heals 15 health plus 5% of your magic power, right? You're busting out, let's say Rod of Asclepius in this build, right? Let's throw on, let's clear this really quickly temporarily. Let's go with the absolute best case scenario here in a really aggressive composition here, right? And then we're going to go on ahead and go with Manticore Spike. We're going to get Sovereignty. We're going to grab, for the sake of argument, Shogun's Kusari. And then our fifth item is going to be more physical. You know, let's be the most optimistic. Let's go with a nice Jade Emperor's Crown for a little bit more magic power, right? And then we're going to build Rod of Asclepius. We have a grand whopping hairy total of 120 power. Do you know what 5% of 120 power is? If you said 6, you're spot on correct. 6 plus 15 is a grand whopping hairy total of 21. Yes, it's great if you combine it with the appropriate amount of HP 5. In fact, the monolith can heal a surprisingly large amount of health when combined with Sovereignty, which is another reason why I build Sovereignty so often on Terra. It combos really well with monolith. You just stand there for a good, the whole thing lasts 5 seconds. I'm sorry, that's the damaging area. It's 5 seconds either way. No, the monolith itself is 10 seconds, excuse me. You stand there for 10 seconds, right? You're increasing HP 5 with Sovereignty by 25. So you're healing 50 HP through the HP 5 alone. That excludes any other HP 5 they possess either naturally or through other items. So that's 50 HP there. Plus the 10 seconds of the 15, right? And that's going to be, we're going to throw on Rod of Asclepius on that, and we already calculated that that's going to be a grand total of 21. 21 over 10 seconds is 210, right? So you're actually healing like 260, which isn't bad, but it's not a huge difference. Again, we're only talking about a 6 health difference per tick. It's basically the difference between 210 or 150 HP, right? You're only healing an additional 60 HP. Rod of Asclepius, I very rarely find to be worth the slot, at least from a support standpoint, and even a lot of times from the solo standpoint. I only generally build Rod of Asclepius when my allies also heal. And they have to be pretty dedicated to the heal. I'm not talking somebody building lifesteal, okay? Because it's still not going to make that big of a difference. Because that lifesteal is going to be... A lot of people don't really exceed... I want to say... I'll be stunned if people exceed 40% lifesteal, right? A lot of people will throw 2 lifesteal items on there, hit about 40% lifesteal, call it a day. Increasing that by 20% isn't going to do a whole lot of people a lot of good, right? Say somebody has... Let's be really generous. 40% lifesteal, 300 power. Now we're talking 120 health per shot. Increase that by 20%. What are you going to get? Right, you're going to get 24 extra health. You went from 120 health healed per shot with Rod of Asclepius attached. That's suddenly going to be a really magical 144. Not really worth it, in my opinion. But somebody with a more dedicated heal, like Held, Chang'e, Olren, even, right? These are going to be the kinds of things where you're going to potentially want Rod of Asclepius. It's going to depend. It's worth considering only really in that circumstance. So I do build this, but very rarely, and only in that very specific context. Now, it is worth noting, again, good old Witchblade. I build this a lot against heavy auto attack enemy compositions. I like Toxic Blade in certain circumstances. Now again, part of my fondness for Toxic Blade comes from the fact that the anti-healing gets way higher on this than it does on Contagion or Pestilence. These tend to be only 25%. Not really a huge deal. Again, we just finished talking about how little Terra actually heals in the short term, and in the long term it's about, optimistically, roughly 250 health, right, for a full ability for the full 10 seconds. Magical. 25% off of that kind of thing isn't really a whole lot. Let's be really honest. Right now, baseline, no power Terra with Monolith is going to heal 150. So let's use her heal as an example here in terms of anti-healing, right? Enemy team is healing 150 HP over the course of 10 seconds. Let's even throw on Sovereignty and call that an even 200. Right, you're reducing that by a quarter. Boy, you're taking away 50 HP total healing. Late game, that's not really that big of a deal. Sure, sometimes it'll make a difference, but overall, not really. Compare that to Toxic Blade, which is a whopping 60%. You are taking away 120 HP of healing out of that 200 HP from an enemy Terra with no power, again, with Sovereignty. That is a really impressive difference. And you might be wondering, Professor, does anti-healing affect HP 5? Absolutely it does. At least the last time I checked, which is recently. Yes. So, Toxic Blade just is more impactful and similar to the Sylvanas, where he has the benefit of AoE. When you have a Standing Stone up, which is again either the Monolith or the actual Earthen Wall, that makes Terra's auto attacks a cleave, which means it's an AoE in front of her. She hits basically everything in an arc in front of her, which is, again, really impactful for Toxic Blade because you can anti-heal multiple targets at the same time in the middle of a team fight. Typically 2, possibly 3 on the occasion. But on average, you're typically going to be anti-healing 1 to 2 targets. You have a slow attached to your auto attacks at that point, so it's pretty easy to lock them in. Assuming you don't also have Gem of Isolation, which is another way you can slow down enemies and keep them locked in. So for anti-healing, I do prefer Toxic Blade on Terra. Again, this is somewhat contextual because she does have that cleave. She does have the ability to lock the enemy down. I have been known on very rare occasions, but it is also very effective, just not my preference, to use Divine Ruin. And this is a very slept-on item with Terra. Again, you have a lot of abilities that provide a huge amount of surprise damage, right? Not even damage as a number, but damage sources, basically. Your ult, enemy gets hit 4 times, boom, suddenly they're affected by anti-healing of 40%, which is a decent amount, right? Very impressive. You shatter your Monolith, everyone in that damage zone gets constantly refreshing anti-heal. Oh, you decide to bring up your earthen walls, but you shatter them instead of slamming them together? Huge cones of anti-heal. Again, it's not my preference because I just really like the HP increase and the attack speed increase on Toxic Blade. I like the increased anti-healing. The mild movement speed increase sometimes helps me out. I don't really care much for the penetration as a support, or even as a solo a lot of the times. Sometimes. But I just prefer Toxic Blade on Terra. But if you're more comfortable with Divine Ruin, absolutely use that. I just very rarely build Pestilence or Contagion. There are certain contexts I will use these. For example, the enemy team decides they're going to go absolutely hog wild and they go for 4 physicals. Yeah, I'm going to build Contagion. Who wouldn't, right? Same thing with a 4+ magic team comp. Oh, you've got only 1 physical enemy? Let me throw on a Pestilence. That's 80 magic protections, 250 health, and a sweet little anti-heal on there too, right? Again, assuming you actually need the anti-heal in the first place. But I am very fond of Toxic Blade in that particular instance. Something else you can splash on if the enemy team is really damaging and you might possibly be behind, right? It happens. I've been known to throw on Stone of Fall, right? You're already getting a slow on your auto attacks that also happen to be a cleave whenever you've got a standing stone. So you already want to attack with your auto attacks at the very minimum to slow the enemy for basically free, right? Your auto attacks don't cost mana. That is a free slow attached to your auto attacks. Stone of Fall is great because it's going to give you both protections, and it's going to give you a great damage mitigation passive. That also gives you CCR, crowd control reduction, as well for a brief amount of time, and this just constantly cycles every 10 seconds, and it's just really great. So if you're behind for some reason, maybe you made a mistake, I do that often enough, or maybe your ADC does something crazy and you have to save them and you die for it and you're behind, understandable, good job on saving your ADC, build Stone of Fall to come back in the late game, right? It's something I do like to use on her in those situations when I'm specifically behind, or if the enemy team composition is abnormally aggressive, like they don't have any warriors or guardians on their team. I'm gonna get a little nervous about the damage input I'll be receiving, and I'll sometimes throw on Stone of Fall even if I'm ahead at that point, just because I want that damage mitigation, right? Just to kind of keep me alive. Right, it just really helps. So Stone of Fall is something I like to build sometimes. Void Stone, if I have enough magic allies, and I'm looking to go. Usually solo Terra, I'll bust out a Void Stone on. I don't usually build Void Stone on support Terra. I have been known to do so on occasion, but again, that really depends on my team comp. If I have enough magic damage allies to make that worthwhile in the long term, yeah, I'll go for it. But that's not very often, right? And even then, a lot of the times, I'll only build Void Stone if I have enough magic damage allies and I don't have enough auto attack allies, right? But Voidstone can also be very effective on Terra as well. Again, sometimes I'll build Jade Emperor's Crown against enemy team compositions that have a lot of auto attackers. Lotus Crown helps make your allies more durable whenever you throw down your heal. I don't build Celestial Legion Helm on Terra. Once in a blue moon I'll build it on solo lane Terra, but even then a lot of the times I'd rather have Breastplate of Valor for the cooldowns, so even in that specific context, a lot of the times I'm not building this, right? Celestial Legion Helm is more of something I'll throw onto a mage whenever I need some surprise physical protections. I don't really build it on solo or support lane Guardians, generally speaking. I don't know why I brought the helmets up again. I really want to come back to the stats because I want to talk about Warlock Staff. I don't build this. Not terribly often, unless I'm specifically looking to go for an Animosity build, and even then a lot of the times there are better items, like Ethereal Staff is better for that. I don't build Warlock Staff on her, even in solo lane. I just don't. There's just better items. I'd rather have Voidstone, I'd rather have Shogun's Kusari, I'd rather have Telkine's Ring, which, by the way, reminds me, it should be in here. Actually, let me throw this up here, because I build this fairly often. Throw Telkine. I'll put the whole thing, because I have been known on occasion, and this is why I very rarely build Voidstone, is another reason I very rarely build Voidstone. Demonic Grip is better, right? Again, that's a 30% magic protection reduction rather than the pure 10% that Voidstone provides, right? And again, this is also going to partially depend on the enemy team composition. I basically ask the same question of the enemy team composition that I would for Gem of Isolation. I ask myself, can slows be fatal for the enemy? Can I lock down somebody with just slows? Does the enemy have a lot of gods that just don't have escapes? If the answer is yes, I'll go Demonic Grip, if I have enough magic damage dealers. Because once I start punching them with the, with the slow attached to my auto attacks due to my passive, they're not likely to get away. Again, Posh, Rom sometimes, depending on how he builds and whether or not you have Toxic Blade. If you're against a Ra, you should. But anyways, Ra, Poseidon, people like that, right? People without escapes, people who just run. Yeah, I'll build Demonic Grip. If they have escapes, then I'll build Voidstone a lot of the times, because at least I can be in the same rough approximate location and still reduce their magic protections that way, especially in team fights. If the enemy team composition is sufficiently magic damage based, I'll throw on Talisman of Energy. Again, very rarely happens. I'll also usually throw on Heartward Amulet for the same reason. Very rare, but it does happen. I don't often build Spectral Armor on her, just because in a lot of situations I have so much potential crowd control. I've got a root, I've got a stun, I have my double dash if I really want to run, I've got my ult if I really need it. I just have never particularly found a high need for Spectral Armor, right? But that's typically where I approach Terra. Now for my relics, teleport if you're a solo lane, I build Cloak of Meditation fairly often. Magic Shell should be in the relic slot of literally any support player, just for Phantom Shell, okay? I have this on all of my Guardians, and if I don't, I've just forgotten to throw it on there. It should be on there. Phantom Shell is incredibly useful against Ymir, Odin, people like that. There's only a small number of them now, and there will always be a small number of them, but that number will increase gradually over time. Besides, it's still a good item besides that. I tend to build Belt of Frenzy as my second relic on her, though, because again, I have pretty good auto attacks with a standing stone up with either the monolith or the crashing stones. And Belt of Frenzy combined with that nice increased auto attack damage and the just your ability as Terra to bring surprising amounts of damage to a jungle camper team fight. Belt of Frenzy can be really impressive in terms of damage output, especially if you're going for a tower or a phoenix. Your attack speed is going to increase, which is going to increase it's going to increase your passive effect, which means your auto attacks are going to be more effective against that tower or phoenix. Right. Very effective. I build this very often as my second relic, sometimes my first one, but usually my go-to first one is either Cloak of Meditation or Magic Shell. I know a lot of people like Belt of Frenzy as a very early item. Honestly, my main issue with that is that a 10% increase in damage isn't really that big of a deal so early in the game. Some people don't even have any damage, and a lot of people who do have damage are only running around with something like Death's Toll, where they have 15, 20, 25 power. Let's take an example, right? Let's look at a beautiful example. Let's look at Amazon Cobb, right? Let's look at him at level 3, right? Because I see a lot of people build Belt of Frenzy and activate that at level 2, 3, right? We're talking about 45 basic attack damage. Let's throw on no, let's go with Gilded Arrow. Let's give it the best chance. Gilded Arrow, and then we go with, let's see, a lot of people. You know what? We won't even build Gilded Arrow because this is Amazon Cobb. Let's go with what a lot of people build: Bluestone Pendant, and we're gonna go with just the Morning Star because a lot of obviously players at level 2 or 3 with Amazon Cobb are gonna run this. Right now we're looking at 67 basic attack damage. Throw on Belt of Frenzy, which is this really impressive, just absolutely glorious 10% damage increase, and suddenly, for the low price of your relic slot, which could have been used for something that's going to save your life, or help allies, in the support's case, but you're going to be doing a whole entire 7 more damage. Plus 25% attack speed. So let's look at that, right? What is the difference on attack speed here? Do we have a pure 25% attack speed? Does not look like it. I would have really liked... Oh, here we go. We do. Oh no, you can't build Berserker's Shield, can you? Never mind. 25% attack speed on Aussie, right? Pay attention to this attack speed. 1.24. 1. 1.24. 1. This is increasing your attack speed by literally 1.25. Right? Because your actual baseline... And now you might be wondering, well, it's 1.00, and then it becomes 1.24. It's because this attack speed is actually scaling. This increase in attack speed is scaling off your base attack speed. That's something a lot of people don't know. When you increase your attack speed, you're actually increasing your attack speed based on the baseline percentage. In this particular case with Amazon Cobb, his baseline attack speed is 0.97. That is his level 1 baseline attack speed. So when you throw on Aussie, it is 1.2, right? It is rounding up, and then as time goes on, that gets better and better, right? Consider, for example, we're at 1.27, boom, 1.51. That is a 24. That actually adds up if you actually do the math. 1.27, that is a 0.24 increase, not a 0.25 increase, because his baseline attack speed is just under 1.0 enough that a 25% increase only increases his attack speed by 0.24, not 0.25. If he had an even 1.0 attack speed here, that would be a literal 0.25 increase in attack speed. Right, just to keep that in mind, just to kind of explain attack speed a little bit, because I don't think I've done a good job of explaining that. But anyways, random video for that to be brought up in. But this is why I don't generally build Belt of Frenzy as my first relic. So early in the game, it really doesn't make the biggest difference. Now, I know some people are going to come on here and they're going to say, well, it's really helped me win, some early game fights. Yes, it can. I'm not saying that it can't be effective. that early. Anything can be effective in any situation given the right circumstances. That's not the issue. As a support, there are better things to build. You might see Belt of Frenzy as this potentially huge deal. You're doing an increased, I'm rounding up, 7 increased damage, and your attack speed is going up by 0.24. That might sound like a lot, but let me show you, I'm busting out with, say, Magic Shell. I am busting a 100 health. At this point, we're assuming level 3, so 136 health shield, plus 20% reduced damage from basic attacks, right? You're increasing your damage by 10%, okay? That is an increase in your damage. I'm decreasing your basic attack damage by twice that. Yes, abilities are a different conversation entirely, and abilities can hit decently hard under the effects of Belt of Frenzy. Very true. To take Amazon Cobb, assuming a level 1 ability here on Swarm, that is 60 damage plus 70% of your magic power. I'm going to round up to 70 here. Right, we're talking about a 4.9 increase in your... No, that's 67. I'm sorry, 70%. That's 49 increase in your damage. So that's 109 damage. 10% increase in that damage is, in fact, 10.9 rounded up to 11 increased damage. Yay, verily. Right, it just isn't that big of a deal. And as a support, you might see the... It's disappeared. No, it hasn't. You might see Belt of Frenzy as a support and say, oh, 10% increased damage and 25% increased attack speed. And you're going to bust that out at level 1, 2, or 3. I see it very often, okay? But I, as the enemy support, am building Magic Shell, and just like that, not only am I reducing damage from basic attacks by twice your increased damage, but I'm providing my allies with a health shield at the same time, which is just going to absorb all of your bonus ability damage, and then some. Okay? I just don't like Belt of Frenzy as my first relic. It does not do as well as people think it does. It still can make a difference. Yes, again, anything can make a difference. Anything can be really effective given the right context. It's just that the number of contexts that Belt of Frenzy is really effective in are not as common, unless you're partying up with your support, in which case maybe you have a very specific strategy, which I see fairly often. But generally speaking, Belt of Frenzy is not going to be as useful as a level 1 relic as Magic Shell is a lot of times. Right? Even the Cloak of Meditation, right, that is 10 plus 3% of their missing health, even that isn't going to heal as much as just throwing on a nice shell. Okay? So I don't build Belt of Frenzy as my first relic. It is going to be my second relic in a lot of situations, because at that point, now we're talking way more damage on your auto attackers, on your non-auto attackers. You yourself are going to be doing more damage. You yourself are going to be doing more with your attack speed as Terra. So typically, Belt of Frenzy is usually going to be my go-to second relic. Sometimes there are exceptions. Maybe the enemy team has a lot of self-heal and I need to build an Ankh. It happens, but generally speaking, Belt of Frenzy is a second relic for me personally. Again, I also happen to be a bit more of a defensive player than most. Maybe you just really appreciate the aggression of Belt of Frenzy, but this is generally where I go with my relics on Terra very specifically, okay? And just some kind of ideas for food for thought. Now, again, just one final recap. For Terra, besides Demonic Grip, I will build Telkine's Ring as a solo lane Terra, but it's not really something I build outside of that. Every once in a blue moon, I'll splash it on for some bonus damage in a slash or an arena. I don't have a whole lot of time. I don't have a whole lot of gold left at that point. It's my 6th item. Throw on Telkine's Ring, get a bit of extra damage in there. I've done it before. But at the end of the day, Demonic Grip is more likely what I'm going to be building out of this, and I'll only really build Telkine's Ring if I'm going for a solo lane Terra or a hybrid Terra, because we already have a tank, right? That happens a fairly decent amount. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.